All right, so you're ready for a deep dive into the book of Joshua, huh? Buckle up, because this one is packed. It's not just about epic battles, though we do get plenty of those, but it's this incredible blend of history, law, theology, all swirling around this moment where the Israelites, after generations in the wilderness, finally step foot into the promised land.
Talk about a we made it moment, right?
Yeah.
But imagine the pressure on Joshua. I mean, this is the guy who's following in the footsteps of Moses, the guy who parted the Red Sea. Now it's his turn to lead them into Canaan, and it's not exactly a welcoming committee waiting for them. This is a land already filled with powerful, established enemies.
Yeah, you don't even have to read between the lines to see that. It's right there in those opening verses of Joshua. God's giving him a pep talk, divine style, saying, be strong and courageous, hold fast to the law Moses gave you, and don't worry, I've got your back. This idea of courage being tied to obedience, it just jumps out at you right from the start.
And it's not just blind obedience either. It's about really knowing those laws, making them part of who you are. God tells Joshua to meditate on them day and night. It's like, when a surgeon scrubs up before surgery, it's not just a rule they're following, it's ingrained in them, it's second nature. That's the kind of relationship with the law Joshua is urged to cultivate.
And the stakes, wow, they couldn't be higher, right? God lays out this incredible vision for them, the boundaries of this promised land. It's not just a plot of land, it's vast. From the wilderness all the way to Lebanon, over to the Euphrates, down to the Great Sea, God's promise is, every place where you set your foot will be yours. This is about stepping into a destiny generations in the making.
And that destiny, it's all wrapped up in this idea of covenant, that binding agreement between God and the Israelites. And it's not a one-way street. God's faithfulness is on full display with this promise, but the Israelites, their success is contingent on their faithfulness in return, obedience to the law. That's a major part of upholding their end of the bargain. Promises, even divine ones, usually come with a bit of fine print.
So Joshua's got his marching orders, this incredible promise, and the weight of, history on his shoulders. But before they just march in blindly, he sends out some spies to scope things out, specifically Jericho. And that's where we meet one of the most intriguing characters in this whole story.
Rahab. Yeah, talk about fascinating. She's a Canaanite woman living in Jericho, enemy territory in her profession. Let's just say it put her on the fringes of society. But here's the thing. Despite all that, she recognizes the power of the God of Israel.
And it's not just a passing acknowledgement, is it? Her story throws a real curveball into this whole conquest narrative.
Absolutely. Here are the Israelites. They see themselves as God's chosen people, set apart. But then you have Rahab, this outsider, who shows remarkable faith. She's heard the stories, right?
Yeah.
About this God who parted the Red Sea, defeated kings, and she believes in his power even more than some of the people who claim to worship him.
And she puts her neck on the line for it, too, hiding those spies, knowing full well that if she's caught, it's curtains for her. She even lies to the king's men, which, let's be honest, isn't exactly following those 10 commandments she's clearly heard about.
And yet she's not condemned for it. In fact, it's presented as this act of faith, this recognition of the one true God. She and her family, their promised protection when Jericho falls, really makes you think about who's considered righteous, doesn't it?
It does. You could say it's like a sneak peek into the New Testament idea that God looks at the heart, not just the outward appearances. But all right, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Those spies, they make it back to Joshua, and it's time to cross the Jordan River.
Yeah.
And this is no ordinary river crossing. Right?
No kidding. This is about as symbolic as it gets. It's a deliberate echo of that Red Sea crossing, that pivotal moment in their history when their ancestors escaped slavery in Egypt. It signifies a new beginning, a crossing over from slavery to freedom, from wandering in the wilderness to finally entering the land of promise.
And talk about a grand entrance. No parting the waters with a staff this time. Just the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They step into the Jordan, and the river just stops. The waters pile up, creating dry ground for the entire Israelite nation to cross. I mean, can you imagine witnessing that? It's like the river itself bowed down to the God of Israel.
And they weren't about to let anyone forget it either. They set up 12 stones, one for each tribe, right there in the Jordan River as this lasting monument. But they weren't just pretty rocks. It was a tangible way to pass their story down to their kids and grandkids. It was like saying, look, this is where God moved for us, literally.
Like those historical markers you see on road trips, only instead of George Washington slept here, it's God stopped a river here. But okay, so far we've got promises, a miraculous river crossing, but we haven't even gotten to the actual conquering part. Jericho, that heavily fortified city, it's still standing between the Israelites and their destiny.
And Jericho, well, that's where we really see just how much the Israelites are going to have to depend on God and in ways no one could have predicted.
You'd think after that river crossing, Jericho would just throw open the gates, right? Like, all right, we get it. You've got some serious backup. But no, those walls, they're still standing strong. The battle plan God gives them, it's definitely not your standard military strategy.
It's about as far from a battering ram as you can get. For 6 days, the Israelite army, they march around the city once a day, led by priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing trumpets. Can you imagine that scene? Day after day, this silent procession, just the sound of those trumpets echoing through the streets. I can only imagine what the people of Jericho were thinking.
It's like psychological warfare, biblical style. But then on that 7th day, things get even wilder. 7 laps around the city, those trumpets blaring, and then
On that final lap, at Joshua's signal, the Israelites, they let out this massive shout. And those walls, the ones that seem so impenetrable, they just crumble. Total victory, and it's clear it had nothing to do with the might of the Israelite army.
really drives home the point that this whole conquest, it's not about them, it's about God's power. But this victory, it's not all sunshine and roses, is it? Because God had declared Jericho devoted, meaning everything in it was to be destroyed. And the text doesn't sugarcoat that at all.
It's a difficult passage, no doubt. That utter destruction, even the livestock, it raises some really tough questions, especially for us reading it today. It forces us to confront the stark contrast between how war was waged back then and the moral lens we view things through now.
It's a good reminder that engaging with the Old Testament often means wrestling with some hard truths. But we also see this theme of obedience come up again right after this victory in a way that's almost tragic. The story of Achan.
Achan's story is like this cautionary tale woven right into the narrative. He's this seemingly insignificant guy from the tribe of Judah, and he takes some loot from Jericho after they were specifically told not to. Might seem like a minor offense, but the consequences, well, they were anything but minor.
Yeah, because their next target is the city of Ai, and they get completely routed. Talk about a blow after the high of Jericho. They're confused, demoralized. Even Joshua is devastated. He's pleading with God, trying to understand how they could have fallen so hard so fast.
And God's response is direct. It's not just bad luck or a fluke military defeat. It's a direct consequence of breaking the covenant. Achan's sin, even though he thought he could hide it, it created this rift between the Israelites and God. It disrupted that flow of divine favor.
It's like that old saying, sin will find you out. But it also highlights how crucial obedience is in this covenant relationship. So what happens? Do they just ignore it?
Not quite. They actually go through this whole process to figure out who's responsible. It's like a divine investigation, and they zero in on Achan. He confesses, admits that greed got the best of him. He saw those treasures and just couldn't resist.
And the punishment is harsh. Achan and his family, along with all their possessions, they're taken outside the camp, and, well, it's not a pretty picture. It reinforces this idea that in this covenant, individual actions have ramifications for the entire community.
So what about AI? Do they try again?
They do. But this time, they go in with a different strategy, one that really showcases Joshua's military smarts. Instead of a frontal assault, they use deception, a well-planned ambush.
So what, they send in a Trojan horse or something? Not quite as elaborate as that. Part of the army hides, while the rest pretends to retreat. The men of Ai, thinking they've won, they fall for it, leaving the city wide open. It's a classic bait and switch.
And it works. They take the city, and just like at Jericho, they wipe out the inhabitants. Another stark reminder that this conquest, it's brutal, even while being strategically impressive. But Joshua isn't just a story of military might. The very next thing that happens proves that. The Israelites, they become the victims of trickery.
Ah, yes, the Gibeonites. Now, this is a group of Canaanites who, let's just say, they were a bit more, shall we say, resourceful. When they heard about the Israelites and their victories, they knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight, so they got creative.
Okay, so what do they do?
They decided to play a little dress-up. They came to the Israelites dressed in rags, with stale bread, claiming to be from some far-off land. They invented this whole story about how they'd heard about the God of Israel and wanted to make a treaty with them.
And the Israelites, they fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker.
They did. They made a treaty with the Gibeonites, swore an oath to protect them, without even consulting God first. But then, of course, they discovered the truth, that the Gibeonites were their neighbors all along.
Talk about an awkward moment. You got to wonder if they felt a little bit sheepish after that. So what do? They've been tricked, but an oath is an oath.
And this is where we see that for the Israelites, keeping their word, even when they were tricked into giving it, was paramount. They honored the treaty, spared the Gibeonites, but made them servants. It shows how seriously they took oaths, even if obtained through deception. It was a core value in the ancient Near East, the sanctity of an oath. But this act of mercy, well, let's just say it had some unintended consequences.
Uh-oh. I think I can guess where this is going.
Mm-hmm.
So the Israelites are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here.
Mm-hmm.
They made this promise to protect the Gibeonites, even though it was all based on a lie. What happens next?
Well, news travels fast, and it doesn't take long for the other Canaanite kings to hear about this supposed alliance, and they are not happy about it. 5 of them, Amorite kings, they team up and decide to make an example out of Gibeon. We're talking a serious coalition here.
So it's like this chain reaction, right? One little act of deception has now escalated into a full-blown regional conflict. And the Israelites, because they swore that oath, they're obligated to step in.
Precisely. They can't exactly sit back and watch as their new, if somewhat unwelcome, allies get wiped out. So they march into battle against these 5 kings. And this isn't just another skirmish, it's a showdown, one of those epic clashes that make it into the history books.
And like a lot of those epic clashes, this one comes with its fair share of miracles, doesn't it? That whole sun standing still business, I gotta say, that's the one that always got my attention.
It's definitely one of the most famous and debated scenes in the whole book. The Israelites, led by Joshua, they're winning the battle, but the sun's starting to set. And Joshua, he prays for the sun and the moon to just stop in their tracks so they have enough daylight to finish the job. And, well, according to the text, that's exactly what happens.
Hold on, we're talking about a cosmic timeout here, called by God himself. People have been debating what that actually means for centuries, haven't they?
Yeah, it's one of those passages that's been interpreted in a lot of ways. Some people take it completely literally, a suspension of the laws of nature, a demonstration of God's absolute power. Others see it more as poetic hyperbole, a way to highlight the sheer magnitude of the victory and God's hand in it. Kind of like when we say, it felt like time stood still. We don't actually mean the clock stopped ticking.
So whether you interpret it literally or figuratively, the bottom line is this is a big win for the Israelites. And no matter how it went down, the result is the same. 5 kings captured and defeated. After this string of victories, it really seems like there's no stopping them. They go on to conquer city after city, solidifying their hold on the promised land.
It's like the climax of this grand story. Years of wandering, decades of preparation, all leading up to this. They've transformed from escaped slaves into conquerors, a force to be reckoned with in the ancient world. But then comes the hard part. They've won the land, but now they have to, actually live in it.
It's one thing to conquer, it's another to create a functioning society. They have to go from being an army on the move to a people living within established boundaries. How do they manage that transition?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, at least from a historical perspective. Chapters 13 through 19 of Joshua, they read like a detailed census, outlining how the land is divided among the different tribes. This wasn't some free-for-all land grab. It was a very deliberate process, reflecting the tribal structure that was already in place. Each tribe received their allotted portion, their inheritance in this new land.
But the Levites were different, right? I mean, they were the priestly tribe, set apart for religious service. They weren't given a territory in the same way as everyone else.
Exactly. Instead of a single territory, the Levites were given specific cities scattered throughout the land. These were called the Levitical cities, and they served as centers for religious practice, education, making sure that every tribe had access to priests and teachers.
It's almost like a decentralized network, ensuring that no matter where you were in the land, you were never too far from the heart of your faith. And it's also during this time that they established those cities of refuge, right? Those were pretty revolutionary for their time, weren't they?
They were incredibly forward-thinking. These cities offered sanctuary for people who had accidentally killed someone. Back then, if you killed someone, even unintentionally, you were subject to blood vengeance, meaning the victim's family had the right to retaliate. But these cities of refuge, they provided protection from that cycle of violence. It was a way to ensure that justice was tempered with mercy, recognizing that not every death, even those caused by another person, was intentional.
A pretty radical concept for the ancient world. And you can really see those themes of justice and compassion that are so central to the Old Testament begin to take shape. But what about Joshua? He's led them this far, but he's not getting any younger.
Knowing that his time is coming to an end, Joshua gathers the Israelites together for one final address. And it's a powerful speech full of warnings, encouragements, this heartfelt plea for them to remember who they are, where they came from, and what it all means.
It's one of those classic farewell speeches that's as much about looking back as it is about looking forward. What kind of things does he focus on?
He reminds them of everything God has done for them. freeing them from slavery, guiding them through the wilderness, and now bringing them into this incredibly fertile and prosperous land. But, and this is important, he also warns them about the potential pitfalls that come with success. He's especially concerned about them intermarrying with the Canaanites, adopting their religious practices, which often involved things that directly contradicted the worship of Yahweh, their God.
Don't let success make you forget who you are. It's a message that's still relevant today, don't you think? It's easy to lose sight of your values when things are going well.
No doubt about it. And to really drive home this message of staying true to their faith, they renew the covenant at Shechem. It's like this grand ceremony where they reaffirm those promises that were made generations earlier. A powerful moment that brings Joshua's leadership to a fitting conclusion.
And not long after this, Joshua dies, leaving behind a nation that's completely different from the one he inherited. No longer wandering nomads, they're now a people rooted in their land, bound by their laws, their covenant with God. Yeah. It's the end of an era.
His death, it marks a real turning point, the passing of the torch, you could say. That generation that wandered in the wilderness, they're gone now. It's up to their children and grandchildren, those who were born into freedom, to carry on the legacy.
So after this deep dive into Joshua, where do we end up? What are the big takeaways, the things that still speak to us even after all these years?
On one level, it's a story about faith, courage, and the ultimate fulfillment of a promise. It's about believing in something bigger than yourself, even when everything seems impossible. But it also pushes us to confront some difficult questions about the nature of conquest, the cost of war, and the complexities of faith. And it doesn't always offer easy answers, which can be a good thing.
It reminds us that the Bible, it's not just a collection of fairy tales. It's a reflection of the human experience, warts and all. It's got its triumphs and its tragedies, its moments of unwavering faith and its moments of doubt and disobedience. And maybe by wrestling with those complexities, by asking those hard questions, we can walk away with a more profound understanding, not only of these ancient stories, but also of ourselves and our own journeys. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.